Well, good evening, everyone. Must be. I might be, yeah. All right, all right. We'll get started. We'll go ahead and open in prayer. Well, Father God, we thank you as always. Lord, you're such a perfect and glorious God. We thank you for the opportunity to gather here once again. We thank you for revealing your truth to us, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to gather as believers and or just seekers, Lord, who are seeking to find out what your truth is, how we best understand the world that we live in, and how it makes the most sense, Lord God, based on the evidence that you will show to us and reveal to us. So we thank you for this time to gather. We ask you to bless our time, bless everyone who's come, and we thank you for just being our God and thanking you for all that you do in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we left off a few, points below the end last week. So if you still have notes from last week, we're looking at that. So this was all, we looked at that. Probably the most time we spent last week was on that, the introduction chapter, just kind of talking about the procedures and how to start evaluating things. And you might recall, we talked about the authors are kind of taking this approach. I mean, they're not completely not using the word God or the Bible in the first introductory chapters, but really they're not trying to make any type of logical, rational, evidential case about the scriptures yet. All they're doing is talking about how can we understand as human beings, what methods do we use to understand the world that we live in, and ultimately it seems like the right, rational, correct way of thinking about things is to actually think about it as truth. Not just, I want to believe something, but it's important that what we believe is correct and it corresponds to reality. And so we picked up on that. And chapter 1 was just kind of this statement about, can we actually handle the truth? There's a lot of people out there. It's been going on for years. We live in what people might refer to as a post-truth society, or culture that we live in today, where nobody wants to reveal or accept somebody else's truth. It's like truth is only what I will accept. And we talked about some of those, self-defeating statements that they point out in the book. If you've read through the book or you remember from last week, they kind of talked about, and they'll use this multiple times, this, quote, roadrunner tactic, where you simply just ask whether or not the claim that's being made stands on its own authority or can bear the weight of its own assertion, like there's no such thing as truth, which is immediately identified as a truth claim. And so if there's no such thing as truth, how can you say there's no such thing as truth? You're defeating your own purposes by making a statement about there's being no such thing as truth. So it's just kind of opening up. We'll jump in a little bit later tonight into some philosophical views, names you may have heard of, whether or not you've actually seen what they propose. It would be possibly a different factor. But anyway, let's finish up here. We're in this section on chapter 1, that ideas, including bad ones, have consequences. Yeah. I don't. Not with me right now. Sorry. I might be able to print some at the break if I can jump to that real quick, but unfortunately I don't right now. Okay, so ideas have consequences, including if you have bad ideas, they have bad consequences or unfortunate consequences. So if there is no such thing as morality, we talked about this a little bit last week, but by review, why is it that someone would be upset when events happen in our lives, or we watch on TV, or we read in a newspaper, or read online? Why is it that anybody would be upset by something like mass murder or robbery or medical malpractice or hate crimes and all of these kind of things that you see people of all belief systems seem to just get really passionate about in some way or another? Why would it bother them if we're just a bunch of accidents walking around as water-filled bags of chemicals that were all just here by accident? Why do any of those things matter? And so some people take that to the extreme. And we've seen evidence of that in a great many of actually tens of millions of people being slaughtered and killed because they have zero value for human life. And we're talking about world dictators in the 20th century who have literally decided that certain people or certain classes of people have no value and are actually, it's better to exterminate them than to treat them as human beings. So all of these things have consequences, and we see that. So number two, we send a disastrous message to society when we marginalize or demonize moral values using false or incorrect philosophies, and you'll see some of those tonight. So we continue to ask the question in the opening chapter of this book, can truth be known? And then you see that, I don't know if you've read the book, that there's that evangelism explosion example that Norm Geisler talks about that he had. And it's basically, anybody familiar with evangelism explosion? A few of you probably know it better than I. I've never actually practiced that. I've only read about it. But, basically it's ask, can I ask you a spiritual question? And then the second question is, they say yes to that, which most people do, is if you were to die today, where would you go? Or how certain are you what your destiny would be if you were to die today? And that kind of just has experientially helped open the door for people to have a conversation. And so there's a nice account of Norman Geisler in the book, the author of the book, co-author, having that conversation with a very hardened atheist, right? Walks up to the door and he starts wagging his finger and says, "No, I don't want to have a conversation with you Christians or whatever you're selling." And this is just my quick summary recap of it. But so Norm begins to ask, "Okay, well, so you're an atheist?" And the guy says, "Well, yeah, I'm an atheist." And he's like, and he starts probing that question. Are you sure you're an atheist? So you really know what an atheist means, that you're saying there is no God. You're 100% certain there's no God. And he says, "Well, I don't know if I'm 100% certain there's no God." He says, "Well, then I guess you're more of an agnostic." And then he says, "Are you what was the terms he used? I can't remember now. Are you a easy or a belligerent agnostic? Agnostic meaning I don't know if there's such a thing as truth. I don't know. I don't make any claims towards it." He walks him through, and eventually he's like, "No, I guess I'm kind of more of your average, non-aggressive agnostic." And he says, "Okay." And then they walk through the point, and then obviously the end of that story is that the guy they were having the conversation with ends up becoming a fully committed Christian, serving as a deacon or by a Sunday school teacher in his church and all of that. So again, if you haven't read the story, you do have the book. It's certainly a nice little account there of how that worked. But truth, can it be known? And so we saw that example of why it's important. So we actually would proclaim, I'll agree with the authors for certain here, that we think we can, in fact, as human beings, we've been given the capacity, the skills, the tools by which we can say, yes, there are such things as truth, and we can actually discover them so that we can use them. So we've talked about these super simple, statements of truth before. 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't matter if you're in America. It doesn't matter if you're in India. It doesn't matter if you're on the moon. It doesn't matter if you're in the Andromeda galaxy. 2 + 2 = 4. It's a fundamental universal truth. The boiling point of water at sea level. You might be different at elevation changes and things like that, but it's one of these things. Is it testable? Is it repeatable? Does it happen the same way with the same conditions every single time? Laws of thermodynamics. We actually talk about scientific laws in some cases. And so I don't know what the criteria are for something to actually become a scientific law, but they have held to these scientific laws for quite some time. The first law, second law, third law of thermodynamics, and say, yes, we know what happens. And so we have some of that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about Einstein tonight, but most famous equation of all time is E = mc². I didn't put the superscript, I guess, on there, but it's, if you don't know what that means, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared is a big equation there. And generally speaking, we've proven that to be law or fact. So just some points that most people are familiar with. So if truth can be known, there's some other laws that we can actually put into place. And again, this is a little bit of a review from where we started, but the law of non-contradiction, there's a law of logic called the law of non-contradiction, and it precludes the possibility that all religions can be true, or that any two contradictory truth claims can be true at the same time in the same sense. So if you have, let's say, two religious worldviews, and atheism and agnosticism And materialism and secular humanism are just as much a religion as is Christianity or Islam or Judaism or anything else. They all are religious beliefs. They are fervently held to, passionately defended, and they're based on faith, not evidence. All of them, right, in terms of some level. Now, I think some of them have far more evidence than others. In fact, I think Christianity has the greatest evidence, and that's what this book and this class will help us to see. But they all have truth claims, and if there's a point where you say, well, this, and you just take the basic one we even talked about last week, there is no God is one truth claim, and there is a God is another truth claim. There's no way you can make these two statements true at the same time and in the same sense. There either is or there's not. You can't get a middle ground, and you can't say that whatever you believe is true, because true for you, true for whatever, because there can't be, there isn't a God, but there is a God, and there is a God, and there's not a God. You just can't have that. Can't have contradictory claims about truth. Again, in the same time, in the same sense, you can't, it's always that qualifier there, because there can be things that would change over time, like, let's say, the boiling point of water. The boiling point of water at sea level is 212 degrees. But if you go up half a mile in the elevation, it's going to be different, right? And if you go try to boil water on the moon, it's probably going to be different. The same time, in the same sense, you say, okay, that's a truth. Okay, but in the same way, 2 + 2 is 4. No matter where you go, there's just no scenario by which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. And they'll actually talk about that a little bit later in a couple of chapters deeper into the book. So then we talk about, or the authors talk about truth versus tolerance. Tolerance assumes that we are supposed to accept every belief as true. You might call it religious pluralism. Okay? Pluralism means all things. So tolerance, there's people say, you need to tolerate this, that, the other thing. My beliefs, my practices, what I believe. Well, they're saying, but I can't believe it, I can't accept it as true in the sense of religious pluralism. The same thing. There is no God, there is a God. These are, to say that somehow we can believe the same things at the same time is simply religious pluralism, and it ends up being just nonsensical. It's contradictory, doesn't make sense. In the same way, mutually exclusive beliefs cannot both be true. So attempting to accept or homogenize contradictory claims about God does in fact have eternal consequences, because there's some belief systems that would say there is a God and he created all things and he holds all people accountable for their conduct or their sins, and if we're wrong about how we are accountable to him or what we could possibly do to be in relationship with him or restored or forgiven from sins, if we're wrong about it, it has eternal consequences, right? So it seems really, really important to check these things out. In fact, whether you fall way over on one side of an extreme to say, you'll never find somebody who's more of an atheist than I am. You can't, I'm the greatest atheist that's ever lived, all the way up to, Paul or somebody who's, a Christian who's just a Christian of Christians. They believe wholeheartedly in all these things. You cannot begin to try and homogenize these into one particular belief system. But what's the most important question we could possibly answer? If you're the most hardened atheist, how certain, how have you proven beyond all reasonable doubt that you will not be judged for your sins? Right? In the same way, how can a Christian demonstrate or prove through the evidence that we have available that all human beings will face judgment on a judgment day at some point in time in their future, or all of our futures? You have to be able to wrestle with those things. They can't be mutually exclusive claims. Certainly cannot be homogenized or reconciled, and so that seems to be super important, because if Christians are right, haven't gotten that far yet, but if Christians are right, this small little momentary blip that we live on this earth is so inconsequential to what eternity is, whether you spend it with God or separated from God. Super, super important. So if I were still an atheist, as I was for 27 years, having thought about these things a little bit more deeply than I ever did as an atheist, I would say, boy, I want to be right. I want to know for sure that I'm right, because if what those wacko Christians, what I would have called them at the time, say is true, then I better find out if I'm going to spend eons upon eons upon eons in torturous death or get it right, and so it's important. So religious pluralists who assert that people's religious views should not be questioned, like, hey, you have no right to step into my life and question what I believe or why I believe it. What we find in experience, you can probably back me up or back the authors up on this, that these people who say, we want to just tell everybody around us that you have no right to talk about religion to me, these people are just as closed-minded and dogmatic as those who they're trying to silence when someone questions a religious view, right? They get dogmatic about it and say, no, you have no right to challenge my religious views. They're getting dogmatic. They're getting even religious, I might say, trying to thwart your attempts to have a conversation with them. Because ultimately, what most people do, and this is true of politics, it's true of religion, true of almost every controversial subject out there, most people just would be happy if everybody agreed with them. Right? We would be at such peace if just everybody agreed with me. Well, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean I should agree with you if you're wrong, if you have the wrong viewpoint. So, it is not. We have to come to a conclusion, regardless of our belief system and persuasions, it's not immoral to ask questions about religious beliefs of people. How tolerant is it to tell someone else not to question truth claims about God? Is that tolerant or intolerant? Say, no, you cannot ask me questions, or you cannot have conversations here about God. Is that tolerant or intolerant? It's intolerant, right? And so it's not immoral. It's actually one of the greatest tasks that anybody can have, is to actually solve the box top puzzle of life and say, this is what reality looks like. And the more we can discover it and find it, the better off everybody would be. So the Bible, when we bring the Bible back in this moment, the Bible commands Christian believers, to question religious beliefs. We're commanded to. It is our instruction to have a reasonable faith, to know what we believe and why we believe it, and to engage with anyone else along the way if we believe that we have been exposed to an actual truth that the world needs to hear. It's really incumbent upon us to do it. And if we actually believed it, if we truly, truly, truly believed that every human being has an eternal destiny in either heaven with God or hell in punishment, we would be very, very delicate. What am I going to say? No, I want to say something else. We would be derelict in our life, if we don't tell somebody about their eternal destiny, right? And the responsibilities that we have. This comes up all the time. Jesus commanded people not to judge. Is that true? No. He said don't judge hypocritically, right? He said don't be standing there with this great big sin hanging off of your own conduct and character and then run around telling somebody about their minor little teeny faults, right? He does command us to judge correctly, judge rightly, but we are not to judge hypocritically. We're not to make sure that somebody else feels the weight of our wrath and our judgment while we just simply live a life that's completely ungodly and immoral in our own conduct. So the issue is not whether we make judgments, but whether we make right judgments that are in line with God's standards. Again, this is just getting to that point. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, right. We have this visceral, knee-jerk reaction to somebody telling us we've done something wrong, or we're thinking wrong, or we're believing wrong, or whatever it may be. Most human beings have that push-back kind of attitude that says, I don't want to hear anything from you. All I want to receive from you is positive affirmations and love. The moment you tell me I'm doing something wrong, we're starting to get the stiff arm and, don't want to have a relationship with you in that. Shoot the messenger, exactly. Okay, so what cannot determine what is right or untrue is if we have no standard by which to judge truth or of right or wrong. We have to have a standard. There's got to be some objective standard for determining what is right and what is wrong. And many of you probably heard this analogy before. It's covered on page 49 of the I Don't Have Enough Faith book. But how many have heard the blind men trying to identify what an elephant is? Okay, some of you haven't. Okay, so the analogy is, I don't know if there's a specific number, but let's say you have 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever blind men, and you put them right in the presence of an elephant, and they're blind, and one's got the tail in his hand, and he says, oh, it feels like a twig or a reed or, something like that. And somebody else has got a foot and is like, well, it's like this stable, table or tree trunk or something like that. And somebody else has got the tusk, and, they're like, no, it's like this hard, it's almost like an enamel or a tooth, it feels like. All these people have got to come up, they have no idea. And so the point is, well, all religions lead to the same God. The Buddhists are over here grabbing the tail, and the Christians are over here grabbing the trunk of the elephant and all of that. And so they're all right. All religions are right. All roads lead to God. But we need to discover an objective standard. And so if we actually go from blind to sighted, we can stand back and look at the whole elephant and say, well, you're not wrong about the structure and characteristics of the tail or the trunk or the foot or the whatever, but you're not right about your description of what this elephant is. You need to step back and look at the whole thing and say, no, this is a complete animal, and its trunk looks like this, and its tusks look like this, and its ears look like this, and its feet look like this, right? That becomes the whole picture, and that's what we're saying is we need to have, it's not just, well, you're partially right, so you get credit, and everybody goes to heaven. If we have to have the right picture, and so that kind of, again, stiff arm blocking of truth, saying, well, how could you possibly know that you're right and this other religion is wrong? Well, we have to be able to back up and say, is there an objective way to determine whether or not my view is the correct view, or if I need to change my view to make it the correct view? There's got to be something objective. There is an objective standard. There's something that defines what an elephant is biologically, and we can look at that and say, if you don't get the whole picture of it, if you don't describe what you're looking at, it's not a tree trunk or a twig and a branch, or it's not a palm branch fan for an ear. That's not what it is. It may feel like that, it may sense like that to you, but that's not what it is. It's actually an animal, a living, breathing animal that has all kinds of characteristics, and you're only partially describing one part of its body, and not fully correctly either way. So get that point. That's the whole blind men and the elephant analogy that's often used out there. Questions, comments, anything you want to talk about on that? That just kind of wraps up chapter 1. Okay, let's go to chapter 2. And here's where we're going to start talking about, okay, again, the progression of the book is just start talking about how most of the world who doesn't believe, doesn't have faith in God or Christ more specifically, how do we find out how they think, and how can we deal with those lines of rational thought or irrational thought and reasoning so that we can come to some categories about understanding the world that we live in. Okay, so they open up this chapter, and it's in a table format in the book, but it talks about these categories of belief. What causes any human being, rational thinking with a capacity to think, what causes anybody to think or believe something? Well, I think most of us would agree there are things like sociological reasons for people's belief system. We have parents that believe, so we believe like they do. We have friends, and this is usually what happens with people, or kids growing up, they believe what their parents believe, and then when they suddenly start to differentiate from their parents, and then they start believing what their friends believe, right? And then maybe the more they become socially aware, they start to believe what society believes on social media in today's culture, right? And they start to move in that. Well, I'll just adopt what somebody else has believed. They're not, most people, I think you would agree, most people are not out there at the Library of Congress looking up all of these philosophical systems and trying to come up with truth by themselves. In 2023, most attempts at communicating truth are done in a meme. You got a little picture, you got a little blurb, and people go, okay, it sounds good to me. And they move on. It's not a reasoned, rational, educated attempt to understand truth. It's just, okay, I believe what these people that I like well enough to agree with their viewpoint, I'll agree with them. So that's sociological. There's also physiological. I want comfort. I mean, my greatest desire in life is to live a comfortable life, and that means I need money, I need a bank account, I need a place on the beach, I need whatever. And so whatever helps me get that comfort level I want, that's my belief system. Right? I'm looking for something to get from it, and so these physiological responses is what makes up my belief system. Peace of mind, meaning, purpose, hope, my own true identity, all of these things people will adopt as a belief system, but again, generally without a lot of thought process going into how did I get to that belief system. It's just, it's a means to an end to get me where I want to be physiologically. Religious, and so people will certainly turn to Scripture, or they'll trust their pastor. If he believes it, it's good enough for me. Or their guru, or the rabbi, or the imam, or whatever the church statements of faith are, whatever it is. They might go that far. I'll believe what they believe, but I don't want to think so deeply that I have to actually, again, investigate these truth claims for myself. I'll just take some trusted leader in that area and believe what they say. Philosophical, and looking for, it gets a little bit deeper, takes a little bit more work, but in a philosophical sense, you're going to look for consistency. Does the world that I live in seem to match this philosophical view that I'm either constructing on my own or picking up from somebody else who has thought philosophically about the world we live in? But they should maintain some level of consistency. I look at the world, I look at the philosophical viewpoint, and they seem to match up nicely. That seems to work well. So they should be coherent. As you'll see, we don't have a lot of coherency in the couple of guys we'll talk about in a moment. Or what is the best explanation for the world that we live in. So, we've looked at this a little bit last week as well, but an apologist, someone who we move from these, I got influenced into my beliefs into becoming an apologist, someone who can show good reason and evidence to support or contradict a particular belief. Now that's where you start to actually advance into something where I have to take personal responsibility to say, I want to be an apologist. I want to both defend my own views and then show others when those critical questions and those objections come along. I want to be able to say, no, there's a reason why I believe what I believe. So it advances up a level of responsibility and usually a level of effort to get there. So there's a couple of points under that. A teaching is only worth trusting if it points to the truth. That would seem to make sense, that I'm going to trust this teaching from a book or from a teacher or a pastor or scientist or whatever it may be, but only if it actually points to the truth. If it doesn't point to the truth, then you might as well believe anything you want, because it doesn't really matter. You're not looking for truth. Apathy, meaning I have no care or concerns about truth, can be dangerous in this life, and of course, as we mentioned a moment ago, in the life to come. If we're apathetic towards truth, it could have very disastrous consequences. So many, you might even say most, beliefs people hold cannot be supported by evidence. I want to just let that sink in for a moment. Most beliefs that people have cannot be supported by the evidence. Now you say, we're here in a Christian church and we're all Christians, and so is that true? Is that true for us? Most people's beliefs cannot be supported by their evidence. I can give you some statistics on that for us Christians and say, the statistics are pretty solid. Only 6% of Christians have a biblical worldview. So generally speaking, most people's beliefs aren't supported by the evidence. Okay, and that's true of all belief systems. Conversely, truth is not a matter of subjective preference. It's a matter of objective fact. I hope no one is a Christian because it feels good, or you get, some type of accolades from your people you live with or you're friends with or whatever it may be. Hopefully, it's not a matter of subjective, I like it, so I'll take it, or I like this kind of claim. Hopefully, it's really a matter of looking at facts objectively and saying, this matches with reality. Like we said, the authors here are using this analogy of the box top of a puzzle and saying, the puzzle that I put together actually matches the world of the picture of what I'm supposed to match. If I get something that looks completely different, then my reality doesn't match the objective standard of reality of what the puzzle was supposed to look like when I was done. So, facts, there's this statement that's always out there. We don't, when it comes to truth, we don't invent truth, we only discover truth. Now, obviously, we can make choices. You made a choice to be here in class tonight, and so the fact is you're here, that's true. So you participated in that fact, but we only can discover, especially when we're talking about the big questions of life, we don't invent truth, we discover truth. Okay? We don't discover the boiling point, or we don't decide, I want to make the boiling point of water 212 degrees at sea level. You go out there and you find out what is the boiling point of water at sea level, and you say, lo and behold, every single time it starts boiling at 212 degrees. We discover that truth. We don't invent the truth or influence the outcome of truth in that way. So truth is truth, no matter where you come from or what you believe. Doesn't matter if you're from America, doesn't matter if you're from Russia, doesn't matter if you're from Africa, it doesn't matter if you're from India. Truth is truth, no matter where you come from or what you believe in contrary claims to the truth itself. Truth is always truth, independent of the person thinking about the truth. All right, so I know that's all just kind of, let's get started. That's a little bit not the most exciting part of this whole thing. Let's talk about what is a little bit more moving towards some of these things. How can we, as rational thinking human beings, kind of starting with a clean slate, how can we begin to follow some rules of logic or rules of rational thought and reasoning to come to an understanding of the world that we live in? Well, let's talk about some of these. The rules of logic, and this is on page 56. Either or, okay? There's only two choices in most of these attempts to define actual statements of truth. I'm either alive or I'm dead. You're either alive or you're dead. Okay, and so that gets into this excluded middle. I can't be both dead and both alive, and I can't be partially dead and partially alive in these kind of things. You're either biologically, medically, technically alive, or they say the time of death is this, and you're dead. Okay, you're pregnant or you're not pregnant, right? There's just not really an in-between. For the women who could be pregnant, right? You're either that or you're not. You're either married or you're not. Doesn't matter if you're going through to get married or you're going through to get unmarried. You're either married or you're not. You have this document that says either you're joined in matrimony to another person, or you have a document or lack thereof that says am not married to somebody, right? You either are or you're not. And there's just all these things. And so it's either or. You can't have, it talks about the excluded middle. You can't have these sort of quasi-claims to truth. And you can think about all those things. Just like we talked about last week and then a few moments ago, there either is a God or there's not a God. You can't have a partial God. You can't say, well, the world has God for people who believe in him, but for people who don't believe in God, there is no God. That's not logical. The law of non-contradiction is self-evident. There needs to be no validation. Everybody knows you can't have a contradiction. You can't say, I'm dead and I'm alive. These are two contradictory claims. It's just thinking about logic and reason in such a way that we can understand it. And what becomes important is the opposite of true is false. Okay? So in this whole scenario, you can say, I'm not married. Okay, all right, and so that means you can't say, there's no way I can say, well, therefore you must be married, right? Or The opposite of true is false. So if somebody says, are you married? Then you can say, then that means you cannot possibly not be married. Okay, if it's the opposite of what we just claimed here, I'm married, then the opposite can't be true. The opposite is false. Okay. So here's this extreme example again. There's some really comical parts of this book if you read it. They have this quote from Avincia. Not sure if that's the right way to pronounce it. He says this about these kind of thinking about these rules of logic. Anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until they confess that not being beaten or burned is not the same thing as being beaten or burned. Right? You get what he's saying, right? He's saying don't be contradictory, right? Being burned or beaten is not the same thing as not experiencing being burned and beaten. They're very different things. And people who believe that, all truths are true, or all truth claims are true, right? Here's a guy who's like, I'm so frustrated with you people who won't claim that there's truth in the world, is saying, look, if you walk up to me and you say, I don't believe there's such thing, I think there can be contradictory truth claims, well, then you should be beaten and burned until you agree with me that it's different to be burned and beaten than it is to not be burned or beaten. Okay. I wouldn't make quite such a claim, but you get the point, right? There are contradictory statements that need to be dealt with, and illogical statements should be refuted. Okay, so how many have heard of David Hume? How many have heard of Immanuel Kant? Okay. Those of you who raised your hand, can you explain their kind of philosophical statements particularly well? Okay. Most of us, some of us have heard, not all, some of us have heard of some very, very, very influential philosophers from centuries past. David Hume and Immanuel Kant. So Hume, the discussion of him starts on page 57. And according to David Hume's theory, he says this. Okay, all meaningful ideas are true by definition or are based on senses. Okay, true by definition. Like we talked about this last week, water is wet. Okay, water is wet is true by definition. Don't need any proof claims or any ways of proving that water is wet. It's just true by definition. Or it's based on senses, right? Fire is hot. I put my hand in the fire, I get burned, okay? I've got senses that help me to evaluate the truth that fire burns people or fire is hot. Okay? So he says, the important point here is all, right? All meaningful ideas are true by definition or based on the senses. Anything beyond the physical should not be believed, is his claim. Anything beyond the physical is not to be believed as any kind of truth claim. So anything that's not physical should not be believed. So he claims this. So verifiable abstract reasoning such as math, 2 + 2 is 4, 10 divided by 2 is 5, whatever, right? It's verifiable by abstract reasoning. And it should be empirically verifiable through our senses. See, these are the way he's trying to evaluate the world that we live in. But you'll notice pretty quickly here, he's doing all he can to exclude the possibility of God in his philosophical view. Because it has to be verifiable or, true by definition in the sense of what human beings can sense. Okay. So he says, anything that does not fit this system from David Hume should be burned because it contains nothing but sophistry or illusion, right? So he wants to take, I don't know, I probably didn't bring a Bible. Well, I did. No, I did. Good. So his point, like I said, is really clear. Everything is true because it is either objectively true, needs no proof whatsoever, or we can sense it. And so he says, look, anything that doesn't fit my definition, such as this book or really any other book that I have up here, should be burned because it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. Okay. And then A.J. Ayer went along and added to this viewpoint a little bit, talking about true by definition or empirically verifiable out there on page 58. So, Dr. Geisler is on page 58. Or page 59. This might be my favorite part of the whole book. For those of you who read it, maybe you know what I'm talking about here. So on page 59, he goes through this whole example where he, as a student, was given a class to talk about this whole thing. Let me see if I can find it. Is that right? Okay, so, oh no, that was the teaching one. Okay, sorry. All right, so it says this. So on page, actually it's page 57. I think I wrote it down wrong. So on page 57, let me just read a couple sections here. It says, on the first day of class, this professor gave the class the task of giving presentations based on chapters in Ayer's book, Logic, Truth, and Language. I volunteered to do the chapter titled, The Principle of Empirical Verifiability. Now, keep in mind that the principle was the very foundation of this logical positivism class he was in. It was a part of the entire course. So at the beginning of the next class, the professor said, Mr. Geisler, we'll hear from you first. Keep it to no more than 20 minutes so we can have time for discussion. Well, since I was using the lightning-fast roadrunner tactic, I had absolutely no trouble with the time constraints. I stood up and simply said, the principle of empirical verifiability states that there are only two kinds of meaningful propositions. One, that they are true by definition, and two, that they are empirically verifiable. Since the principle of empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, it cannot be meaningful. That was it, and I sat down. There was a stunned silence in the room. Most of the students could see the coyote dangling in midair. They recognized the principle that of empirical verifiability could not be meaningful based on its own standard. It self-destructed in midair. In just the second class period, the foundation of the entire class had been destroyed. What was the professor going to talk about for the next 14 weeks? Right? You get the point. No, there's no such thing as truth. Is that true? Right? Same thing. The claim that the only truth is empirically verifiable, it's true by definition, and this truth claim that truth can only be known by empirical verifiability or by its own definition is itself not unverifiable by its own system, and threw it out. Right? I mean, I would love to have been in the class with Dr. Geisler making that statement. All right. So you get the point. They're trying, basically, the attempt at David Hume and Ayer here is to get God out of people's minds. Stop thinking about God. I want you not to believe in God. And so they come up with philosophical systems to convince people there's no reason to think that God exists. All right, so I moved on from that. Okay. Number 5, so the response here is the claim that something can only be meaningful and empirically verifiable, true by definition, excludes itself. I read all that. All right. So then we move on to Immanuel Kant. So we start with David Hume. I think that was in the 1700s, right? And then if Kant's philosophy is right, okay, then there's no way to know anything in the real world empirically verifiable according to Kant. So what is Kant trying to do? Immanuel Kant, he says this. Our mind forms the image, and he used the example of a tree, okay, rather than the image imprinting on our mind based on its inherent objective attributes. So, if you haven't read the book or still weren't clear on this, he says, look, if you're looking out the window and you see this tree out there in the grass out here right outside the window, and you see it blowing in the breeze and you're looking at it and you're going, well, I see it has a trunk and it has branches and it has leaves and it's green and has all these characteristics. He's saying you can't trust anything that you just said. You can't trust it. Your eyes could lie to you. And so you have no connection to truth because you can't see truth. You can't accept truth. It might be lying to you. What has happened, according to Kant, was your mind just made up an image. That tree may not even be there. Your mind just envisioned, well, gosh, suddenly today I wanted to see a tree and to have these characteristics, and so my mind just put it there. It doesn't exist. That's a really dangerous world to live in, isn't it? Is that semi-truck there that I'm going to walk in front of, or is it just a figment of my imagination? Right? It's a really dangerous, dangerous world to live in, but people will do anything to excuse God out of their existence. So B, he says Kant says you can only know anything based on how your mind interprets what it perceives, and your mind can't be trusted to know what it perceives. So Kant's conclusion is you can't know anything. Your mind will lie to you. You can't trust your mind. Of all of your senses, 5 or more senses you can't trust any of them. So you can't know anything. He's spent his whole life saying that. And he was a respected professor, well quoted, well known. Immanuel Kant's name is known for many, many centuries now. And people still quote him extensively. Well, right. How can he know he's truth? Because he feels very comfortable with his conclusions. That's the flaw in his argument. Right. Again, once again, it's self-defeating. He can't get there from here. Yeah, Bill. Yeah. Right. Did God really say? Yeah, the devil loves those kind of people questioning. So you see, these are 2 examples of, again, if you haven't taken philosophy, this is if you don't know these names, it doesn't mean anything about you. But if you ask anybody who's ever studied philosophy, I guarantee you they've heard of Immanuel Kant and David Hume. Okay. What do they do? What are they trying to conclude? That they are starting out with a purposed and intentional desire to remove God from their existence. And so they created a philosophical way to look at the world that says there doesn't need to be a God because I've proven him by my own cellular brain power to say there is no such thing as God. Or logic, or reason, or, you can't know anything. You can't know if you're married. You can't know if you had dinner last night. You can't know anything, okay, because your senses could be lying to you. So he even says this, there's an unbridgeable gap between the real world and the mind. Thus, there are no truths about the real world. Is that a system you want to sign up for? Okay. But again, here we go back to the Roadrunner logic stuff. Are his views actually true? Do they correspond to reality? So there's this nothing but fallacy that we see in Kant's argument. Nothing but implies more than knowledge. This is how he gets around. This is how he claims. He claims to have this superior knowledge, this more than knowledge. I've figured out the world. You can't know anything about the world, but the only thing I can know at all is you can't know anything about the world. Okay, I've got this superior knowledge. It's kind of Gnosticism of his day. Kant knows, if you will, the data in his brain receives nothing but just phenomena. He knows it. He's understood it. He's so enlightened. The rest of us just need to catch up with his enlightenment because he just knows it. Because he just knows it. He's superior. He's got this superior knowledge. And us plebeians will eventually get there if we just accept his reality. Okay. Right. So, but in order for him to know what he makes his claim, he would have to see more than the phenomena itself. He has to be outside of his own existence to see that his truth claim is actually corresponding to the reality he's attempting to articulate here. So he's using this nothing but fallacy, meaning there is no such thing as truth except the one truth that I have elevated over everything else. Okay. So in order to distinguish between the real world and what his or any of our minds perceive, he would have to be able to see both the real world, which could be knowable, and his own image of the real world, which only he knows. But this is exactly what he's claiming he can't do. He's claiming you can't know the real world, but at in the same time saying, I figured out the real world. It looks like this. Okay? So he's just patting himself on the back and saying, I'm so much smarter and philosophically more astute than everybody else in the world. I figured out that you can't know reality except the reality that I have articulated. Because this approach, do you agree? This approach makes no sense. It's self-defeating. It uses a logical fallacy, and it's simply does not reflect or correspond to the reality that most of the world lives in. We don't sit there and look at a tree out the window and go, is that real? Is my mind lying to me? I might say, is somebody pulling a trick on me? Are they trying to do an optical illusion and trick me into thinking something? But most of us don't look at trees and cars and buses and people and go, I don't know, maybe it's just my mind making stuff up. Okay. His philosophy, I think, is properly rejected. We can't look at the world through the lens of this Hume or Kant philosophy. Instead, would you not agree, it's also much more logical to acknowledge that what we see and perceive, is actually an accurate representation of reality. We look around, we see colors, we see lights, we see objects, we see things in our world, and they probably, in almost all cases, actually represent themselves accurately to our senses. Seems like the best way to go. But as he says here, this is what happens when a beautiful theory mutes a brutal gang of facts. So Kant and Hume's theories are just beautiful. Cover whiteboards with them, and people can go, wow, how did you come up with that incredible thing? And then the brutal gang of thugs walks in and says, that doesn't match reality. Facts are facts. Right? So you see that on page 61. So truth exists as I think we can make a claim that truth actually exists. It is absolute and it's undeniable. Hume and Kant are simply wrong in their philosophical views of the world. To say that truth cannot be known is a self-defeating claim. There's no such thing as truth, or truth is unknowable. What are we doing once again? Making a truth claim that we cannot be supported by its own assertion. So they're both wrong based on their own attempts to make a statement about facts. So let's get away from Kant and Hume and whatever disastrous attempts to be philosophical that they are, and start looking at, well, how do you actually discover truth? So we get back to this. Law of non-contradiction. Most of us really realize that you cannot have something that's true in the same sense at the same time, because that would be a contradiction, and we can't live in a world with contradictions. And then we get to the law of the excluded middle. Something is, it exists, or it is not, does not exist. There is no compromised middle position between existence and non-existence. Existence of God, existence of mankind, existence of marriage, existence of mathematics. There is no such thing as like, well, there's something that we can just play with the middle between here. So, generally speaking, doesn't matter. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to read the Bible. These are well-established laws of logic and reason. You cannot have a contradiction. You cannot have something in the middle between two truth claims. Like these kind of things, right? Either you received a raise or you didn't. Doesn't matter if it's a penny. Doesn't matter if it's something. Either you received a raise at your employer or you didn't. Either a person is alive or dead. Either God exists or he doesn't. We begin to see you can't have something in the middle between those two positions. So without these first principles of logic, discovering any truth would be impossible. Thank God he's given us rational ways of looking at the world. Okay? We cannot have contradictions. We cannot have this excluded middle. And the opposite of true is false. So that helps us do it. So here's an example. I try to gather you back in here for a moment, because I know this is all this philosophical stuff. Just everything we always wanted to do in life is study philosophies that aren't actually real, right? Let's look at how we can actually evaluate the world that we live in. So we use these like soliloquies, I think they're called, or whatever, right? So it starts off with these two premises. Usually this is kind of the minimum level of trying to deal with truth claims, okay? There's a premise, such as, all men are mortal. It's a premise. It's not a fact. It's a premise, okay? That you can go off and try to prove the premise on a separate soliloquy or a truth, logical truth claim, but syllogism. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. All men are mortal. Okay, so if you accept that fact, then we can move on to the second one. Spencer, whoever that might be, is a man. Okay, So if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the conclusion is the only logical, rational way of looking at the world. Spencer must be mortal. Okay. Now, if all men aren't mortal, then that may not be true. If Spencer isn't a man, then it's certainly not true. But if premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, then the conclusion that we draw from that is true. This is the basic reality of understanding all truth. All of it that we can possibly begin to understand. So again, the logical conclusion follows from the 2 premise. Logic does not address the truth claim of these first 2 premise statements, but the conclusion is valid and leaves no other logical option, right? If all men are mortal and Spencer is a man, then what other conclusion can you come to? Spencer's immortal? How do you do that? All men are mortal and Spencer is a man. You can't get to, well, he must be immortal. You can't get to something else. Spencer doesn't exist. Spencer never lived in the first place. No, you just said Spencer's a man. So the only way to get to the conclusion is to say, if the premises are true, the conclusion naturally flows from that statement. Okay. So whether you've ever thought about it before in your entire life, that's how we process information. Okay. We have premises, and we come to conclusions based on evidences. So the premise statements 1 and 2 must be evaluated from observation and drawing, general conclusions, which are, we'll say, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's impossible for us mortal human beings to get to 100% certainty on every attempted proposition. Okay? This is known as inductive reasoning. I don't know if you've heard that term before. Inductive reasoning. You're coming to a point of understanding through induction, meaning letting the evidence reveal itself to us. Okay? That's on page 63. So the conclusion here, all men are mortal, cannot be perfect, since no person can observe the mortality of every person who's ever lived. Right? We can't go and investigate even the 8 billion people that are alive today on our planet, but we can't go back in history and observe the life and death of every single human being from Adam and Eve all the way to us and go, see, I've watched. Every single person dies. But might we feel like we're pretty darn comfortable making a statement that every human being dies. Therefore, every human being is mortal. Okay, we would probably feel pretty comfortable that that captures, beyond a reasonable doubt, the world that we live in, a true reality of the world that we live in. People die. No one escapes death. Okay, so if we got to 99% reality here, then that less than 1%, even if there's some space for doubt, it would never erase the reasonable doubt threshold. Okay? We've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that all men are mortal. Now, we can go through and medically or biologically or some other way prove that one of us is a man or a human being, then I think we can conclude we're going to die. Because all the evidence says 2 things. All people die, and I'm a person. That's how logic, reason, rational works. So, how are truths about God known? That's how we just get general truths about the life and the world that we live in. How could we know truth about God? That seems even more challenging. Well, once again, observation and inductive reasoning, just with any other truth claim. If we're going to understand, does God exist? Is there really a God who's up there in the heavens or wherever he is somewhere? The only way to know beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists is by observation of the world that we live in and inductive reasoning, rational conclusion based on the evidence. That's what I'm asking. That's what the authors are asking. We're going to say, does God exist? It's not a blind faith. It's a rational response to the observable evidence using rational, reasoning techniques to get there. Okay. So, we must, as it's incumbent upon us as human beings, we must observe the effects and come to a rational, reasonable conclusion about the presumed cause that produced the resulting effect. What does it mean? Most of us recognize, and most 3-year-olds and above recognize that we live in a cause and effect world. The universe, everything we have, we see we see an explosion at the building next door, we say, I wonder what caused that explosion. Right? We just believe that something caused the effect. We see it all the time, right? Nobody walks up to, somebody walks in the door of the church and we don't go, gosh, did you just crawl out of the primordial goo and walk into the church? Or do we assume, well, you had parents that brought you into this world? There's a cause and an effect. I'm an effect. My parents are the cause, with God involved as well, to bring me into the world. So we live in this cause and effect world. We begin to think rationally and properly about the world we live in, recognizing that every effect had a preceding cause. Such as, all books have one. Here's another what is it called, Bill? Syllogism? Yeah, I always mess that up. All right. All books have at least one author. That's the premise. Okay? Based on inductive investigation. I walk into any library and I start picking up books and I go, oh, well, there's the author's name. And I pick up another book and I go, oh, there's the author's name. Oh, every time I pick up a book, I seem to find an author associated with the book. So my inductive investigation of the evidence available to me says all books have an author. Okay? And then I pick up our text for this class and I go, well, here's a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Okay, I've got it right here in my hand. So I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is a book. Seems to match any other kind of definition of a book that I've ever seen. Therefore, we can rationally conclude that this book had at least one author. We don't need to know. We don't have to watch them type it into their computer to know that they were actually the author. We just know that all books have authors. This is a book. Therefore, the book that in question must have had an author. Again, seems so logical, so unlike Kant and Hume. So the big question for all of us is, are there any observable effects that seem to require some kind of pre-existing supernatural intelligence in the world that we live in? The answer is yes. The universe is an effect that requires a pre-existing supernatural intelligence to have caused it. Okay. We'll take a break. We'll get back and talking about how can we support that claim. The claim that the evidence that we see in the world that we live in requires supernatural power, supernatural intelligence to have brought the universe into existence. We'll talk about that in a moment. So take 5 and we'll come back. All right, I'm ready to get started again, if you guys are. All right, so for those of you, thanks for coming back. I believe, yeah, I know. I believe that's the worst part of the whole study in terms of, yeah, right? I think we have to get through it, though, in the sense of trying to understand. We're not asking anybody to believe in something based on, trust me, okay? We're not asking people to say, well, just have blind faith and you'll get there, okay? We're saying there's actually a reasonable approach to understanding the truth and the reality of the world that we live in, and we think that we can use those rules of logic and ration and reasoning and inductive discussions to say, well, the philosophical assertions of Kant and Hume don't stand on their own merits, okay? And therefore, we should be well set up on a path to understand and walk through how do we get to reality? How can we possibly understand reality? Okay. So just because, and that's why if you ever hear me say, I've said it before at some point in time, I totally agree with Paul, that what we see in the world is a vain, empty philosophies, right? This is what we have, vain, empty philosophies, trying to explain truth and reality by avoiding truth and reality, okay? And so we have these philosophical things. We have to deal with it because, there are people who go to college and they go to college and they study philosophy and they champion Kant and they champion Hume and a variety of other philosophers and philosophical systems. Didn't get that out properly, and we have to deal with that. But here again, we think we can just, generally speaking, conclude, no, it's a effort of working through the observable evidence to know and understand the world we live in has purpose, has design, it has been given to us as a way that we can explore truth and compare it to what we see and understand how the world is function and whether there's any person or God behind its existence. So with that, I'm gonna jump in here. In chapter 3, they move into the sciencey stuff, okay? And they use this acronym SURGE. I'm going to go over it in brief detail, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm going to diverge from the book quite significantly in this section. But let me just cover what they talk about in the book. Most of us probably know about Einstein, and most of us probably know that he proposed both a special and a general theory of relativity, which ultimately has been proven to 5 decimal places of accuracy in terms of various things like everything in Einstein's mind and what seems to be observable reality is that everything is relative. Time, space, matter, energy, all of these things are relative. Meaning, and in fact, if I could had all the technical knowledge I could tell you, but if you've ever heard of an atomic clock, right? Atomic clocks, that's where we get most of our time synchronization on our watches and phones and all that kind of stuff. It's not just somebody, putting little clicks, design a super accurate little click. It's actually using, atoms to determine clock time. And there's a clock at Greenwich, England at sea level, and there's a clock at Boulder, Colorado, and they are offset by the distance and altitude because time is faster at a higher altitude than at sea level. Not by much, I don't know, a millionth of a second over 100,000 years or something like that. But they're different, right? And exactly according to Einstein's equations. In fact, I think it was in the 70s, the U.S. Navy took these atomic clocks and they put them on airplanes and they flew around the globe. And they flew one westward, I think, and it lost time relative to a stationary atomic clock, and they flew it around the world eastward, and it gained time in comparison to the non-motionary clock standard there, and it was all exactly according to Einstein's equations, right? So even time is relative, and where we get E equals mc squared and all of that, that's where you get big old nuclear explosions or power plants and all of that because of the relativity of these atomic principles. So Einstein, in the early 20th century, started proposing his theories of relativity, and they're one of the things that he hated, if I understand properly, he hated about his understanding of this world that we live in called everything is relative, was that he knew that it implied the universe had a beginning. Every secular, scientific, and philosophical viewpoint up until then wanted to have an eternal universe. It just is. The stuff that's in it, it figured out a way to happen by itself. But the universe itself, the container and everything in it, is always eternal. It's just always been. As we'll find out tonight as well, that's not even logical in its own attempt to make a statement here. But Einstein recognized it, and he even tried to create this what he called himself a fudge factor. Try to create this fudge factor to say, well, maybe the universe didn't have a beginning if we just do this to the formulas that I've proven to be true. And he later called it the biggest blunder of his career, trying to get a universe that doesn't have a finite beginning. Okay, so what we see here is that Einstein, and through other approaches to this, we recognize that in the beginning of our world that we live in, remember we live in this cause and effect world, there was nothing, no time, no space, no matter, no energy. Now, what your materialistic, atheistic, evolutionary thought process is, first there was nothing, and then suddenly it exploded. Wait a minute, well, what exploded? Nothing. And literally nothing. Now, we might think of like, okay, well, time and space must surely have always existed. It's just the matter and stuff in the... No. Time, space, matter, and energy, all, according to Einstein, and through all other forms of scientific investigation, had a simultaneous beginning. Space and time are connected. Most scientists call it space-time, because space and time are connected. It's not just a convention saying, well, let's count time in 24-hour days and 60-minute hours and 60-minute minutes and all that, 60-second minutes. It's actual time. And the universe has its own clock, and time itself had a beginning. And before, we don't know we have to ask God at some point, what was there before you created time, space, matter, and energy? We don't know. But we do know that the universe we live in had a simultaneous beginning of all time, space, matter, and energy. Okay. So literally nothing means nothing. No fundamental particles, no quarks, no empty space, no energy source. Nothing means nothing. Close your mind and think about nothing. You can't, what would it look like? We don't even know, right? We have no idea what nothing but means nothing. But nothing is what we started with. And then suddenly we have something. Okay. So then suddenly, not that long ago really, suddenly space, time, matter, and energy simultaneously came to be out of the nothingness that preceded them. This becomes what is referred to as the cosmological argument, or sometimes called the Kalam cosmological argument. That starts on page 75 of the book. Okay. And once again, because we've now been equipped with this understanding of using logical and reason and inductive reasoning, okay, we say everything that had a beginning had to have a cause. Okay. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe that we live in had a cause that brought it into existence. Proposition 1 is everything that has a cause had a beginning, or everything that had a beginning had a cause that caused it to begin. The universe meets that criteria. It had a beginning, according to Einstein and many secular scientists who have no relationship to a religious system other than their own secular humanism. Therefore, however, the universe had to have something that caused it. I think I probably mentioned this last week, but we talked about, well, this universe has this cause. There's people out there thinking about this universe-generating machine somewhere out there that creates all these multiverses, and we just happen to be one of billions or trillions of multiverses that have been generated into existence. But of course, that all that does, like most things, is kick the can down the road a little bit, and then now we have to ask, where did the universe generating machine come from? How did it get into existence? It had a cause. Something caused it to come. Right. So it doesn't answer any questions. And so thinking about the unthinkable, like multiverses and all of that, doesn't change the laws of logic and reason. The universe that we live in had a cause. What was its cause? And if something caused it to happen, well, what caused that? Okay. And we can say the same thing. That's where we get to, like, people talk about biological life. Well, where did life come from? And we figured, all scientists, biologists have all figured out you cannot get life from non-life. Right? So what do? Do they turn to God? Well, most of them don't. They turn to aliens and say, aliens, whether it's intentional or unintentional, sent the material for life to get started here on Earth. But again, it kicks the can down the road, and you say, where did those aliens get life? How did they get started? Oh, well, there was aliens that started them. Okay, well, let's stop the infinite regression, and let's get back to what started the first thing in the universe. Okay, something else outside the universe had to start it. So the law of causality, cause and effect, affirms that premise one, everything that had a beginning had a cause. This is the fundamental principle of science. Without it, science and scientific discovery would be impossible. We would have there would be no such thing as an employed scientist, because if you don't live in a cause and effect universe, you don't have any ability to do scientific investigation. Okay, what do? They try to eliminate, isolate all the variables, so they can turn one variable and see if that variable creates some kind of change that they either predicted or it falsifies their hypothesis in some way. Right? Science itself is simply just a search for knowledge, a search for causes. So anybody who denies the law of causality is really denying rational thinking. Okay? But again, Einstein has already helped us to understand we live in a universe that had time, space, matter, and energy, had a single point of beginning. Some people say it was 14 billion years ago. Some people say it was 6,000 years ago. But either way, you have a beginning, and that requires a beginner. So the book presents these 5 lines of evidence. They put it in an acronym. They want you to memorize it. I'll just say I'm not super impressed with this area of the book. So one area of the book that because I've studied this stuff so extensively, I don't really jump into it where they do. But they talk about S as the second law of thermodynamics. It's the law of entropy, the law of decay, that everything in the universe tends towards disorder. Okay? And we see that in anything that we do. These chairs in this church right now, somebody tried to set them all in straight lines in order, but guess what? You can look around and go, some of them are starting to move away from that order. Right? They're a little bit out of place. Second law of thermodynamics says that everything in the universe, if it started at a single point of beginning, it starts to wind down. The sun will eventually burn up. The planets will eventually stop rotating and will burn up. And the universe ultimately will suffer a heat death where all useful energy is consumed and there's nothing left. It's never going back. It's not going to have a time where it winds itself back up. All it can do is wind down. They also talk about this expanding universe and Hubble's law, the red shift, and all of that. If you've heard of those things, they look at it and say the universe is expanding. Expanding universe implies that it started someplace smaller, and of course it's getting bigger because it's expanding. So it tends to point towards a beginning, a point of beginning. And then cosmic radiation background, CMB I should say, cosmic background radiation. They predicted that there should be this signature of radiation throughout the galaxy, throughout the universe, and then they tried to figure it out, and they came up with, yes, there does seem to be radiation that's predictable from the Big Bang. Galaxy seeds and the planting of stars in the galaxies and all of that, it goes through this whole lengthy discussion on that. It's not something I buy into or whatever, because I think, from my research, my authors that I have great respect for, Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, I think they are old Earth and even incorporate some evolutionary concepts into their thinking. Doesn't discount the rest of the book for me, but Their sciencey stuff is not particularly impressive to me. And then they go to Einstein's theory of relativity and the beginning. So they use this SURGE acronym. If you like it, if you find value in it, if you're reading the book, then go for it. What I put up here is kind of my life over the last 28 years, just a sampling. It's actually not even all of it. I've got all kinds of books, Noah's Flood, In the Beginning. Here's a book called Trace from Nathaniel Jeanson, who predicted that all human beings on the planet go back to the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and he's proven that seems to be the evidence that we see. He also wrote a book called Replacing Darwin. Everything you see that I'm presenting to you here is, generally speaking, from a young Earth, like 6,000-year creation viewpoint, sciencey stuff. Douglas Axe wrote a book called Undeniable, that we see the evidence of design in everything in the universe. All these different things. J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case detective, set out to figure out whether Christianity is true, and proved, to himself and then hopefully to others, that all the evidence points to the reality of the truth of the scriptures. And then, I can't even tell you how many hours of DVDs and stuff that I've got here that all talk about, if you're interested, there's incredible levels of evidence that support what I believe is the actual reality of life that we live in, that we have a young earth, a young creation, 6,000 or so years, that evolution is not even possible. I could talk about some of these things. Einstein clearly proved the beginning of the earth or a universe. There's so many evidences. There's hundreds, really, of evidences of a young earth, not an old earth. Including things like the salinity level of the oceans, right? If the oceans were continuing for billions of years to get more and more salty, they should be significantly more salty than they are. We talk about things like moon dust. When they flew the Apollo missions to the moon, they thought they were going to find miles thick of dust, because all it does is collect. It never sheds. There's no atmosphere, so it just simply gravitationally pulls in a bunch of dust, and they actually thought they would find miles deep dust before you got to hard surface of the moon, and they found less than an inch when they got there. There's just dozens and dozens and dozens of proofs, if you will, or strong suggestions that we live in a young earth. Biologically, talk about the animal kinds and the plant kinds. Everything's based on, Darwin was envisioning this super simple cell. Didn't even know what it was, but it was, whatever that simple cell is, it's got to be it's just protoplasm. It just got nothing in it, but it comes together, and suddenly you get hearts and lungs and eyes and all this kind of stuff somehow. When we look into the structure of a cell, we see the incredible level of complexity, and it's all built on a digital code of the DNA. And the DNA never shows that it adds new information. All it can ever do is subtract information. Okay, like you've heard of disease what is it? Not chemical, drug-resistant bacteria. Heard of those kind of things, right? Drug-resistant bacteria. Drug-resistant bacteria can happen. It's part of the design that God has built into things, where these bacteria can actually start pitching out parts that are going to harm them if this drug comes in, or this antibiotic or whatever comes into them. It can start pitching out materials and say, well, I can survive if I get rid of all this stuff. But what does it do? It makes itself have less ability to survive in the long run. Okay, and so it never adds new information. All it does is subtract. So you could take a picture or walk up here or ask me to borrow something. I've got all kinds of stuff out on loan, but I just don't think that Geisler and Turek have necessarily a particularly robust description of the science that declares the truth and authority of God's word and the actual reality that we live in. Their attempt is to say the evidence that we see points to God, and I agree with that. I just think their attempts to marry a little bit of biblical thinking with secular science that denies God is probably not particularly helpful there in chapter 3. Bill.
Dr. Michael B., he talks about the human eye.
Yep.
And that gives evolutionists a real
Right.
and you need everything at once
Mm-hmm.
to make it enough.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't evolve without the necessity of the whole system.
Yeah. The eye, the ear, we'll talk about some of these things in here. But yeah, that's true. There's, he's now recently gone to be with the Lord, but there's a medical, he was a medical doctor who was an anatomist with answers in Genesis. His name is Mike, not Denton. Gosh, I just lost his name. Anyway, you can search YouTube, or there's a couple other places you can get it. He's got the hearing, ear, and the seeing eye as a video series out there. It's not like the most like, wow, the best graphics and the best this and that and the other thing. It's incredible. I mean, the complexity of the ear is incredible. Okay, the human ear is absolutely incredible, and the technology and the engineering of the human eye is absolutely like knock your socks off. You can't believe it. So if you want to take some time, it's a great video. Like I said, it's good. It's not like watching, a well-produced movie, if you will. But it's super good information. So it's called The Hearing Ear and the Seeing Eye. If you want to look at that, David Minton, Dr. David Minton is his name. Minton, M-E-N-T-E-N or O-N. I think it's Ian. So really good, excellent stuff. Okay, so I'm going to just move on past that. I've got some other stuff here at the back end. We'll see if we get to it today. So the conclusion, that's jumping to the end of chapter 3 here. The conclusion of a finite universe is no longer in question. Really, all scientists, all philosophers, all atheists, generally speaking, if they study this at all, understand that we don't live in an infinite universe. We live in a finite universe. So the implication of this truth has spawned a great deal of atheistic speculation to avoid the obvious implications. However, no atheistic theory adequately refutes the conclusion that the universe was caused to exist by a supernatural creator or being who pre-existed the universe. Okay. So, scientists and philosophers and other noted thinkers who reject the truth that the universe had come into existence as a result of a supernatural being who created it are doing so as an act of will, not as an objective attempt to find out the facts and the reality of life. The evidence is objective. The disbelieving scientists who refuse to accept the conclusions are not being objective when they deny that a universe that had a beginning must have had something that began it, meaning God. Okay. And then we even get to this. Our timeline is undeniably finite, meaning time itself is limited. Time itself had a beginning. Now, this is where you get into even math. I don't know if you have any mathematician-type folks in here. Well, I know I have one. But mathematician-type stuff, okay, objectively, there could never have been an infinite number of days. You don't have to have gone through all of Einstein's theories and all that. All you have to do is say there's no such thing as infinity. There's absolutely in our universe, now with God there is, but that's outside of our universe. With our universe, there's no such thing as an infinite number of days. Because if you had an infinite number of days, you'd never get to today. Okay? If something like a new day, like today or tomorrow, could be added to infinity, then you didn't start with infinity. Because infinity means it goes from forever on the right and forever on the left, or whichever way I'm looking at it now. Right? It goes as far and far and far. It never, ever, 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 ever ends. So how do you add another day to it? You never get to today if you can't get to the starting point. There's no starting point, you can't possibly get to today. So the fact that tomorrow will add another day to the history of the universe is substantial proof all by itself that the universe cannot be eternal or infinite. Right? Because we're adding days every single, and time is real. It's not just some fabricated thought process. We're actually experiencing the passage of time throughout the entire universe. And as that time passes, you can't possibly have started in infinity in the back and get to today. Because then it wouldn't be infinite. Well, then suddenly you've just destroyed any claims that the universe is infinite as soon as you have another day. You have to be somewhat of a mathematician to try and start figuring that stuff out. But just remember, infinity really means infinity. Just like nothing really means nothing, right? There's just nothing, nothing, nothing. Well, in the same way, infinity means it never, ever, 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 ever ends in that direction, and it never, ever, 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 ever ends in that direction, so you can't add anything to it. It's impossible, because it's already infinite. The conclusion, then, on the cosmological argument is that the cosmological argument is true because both of the premises are true. Everything that comes into being must have a cause. The universe clearly came into existence. So it must have had a beginning. Our universe must have had a beginning. So it must have had a beginner. We haven't defined what the beginner is, but a universe must have had a beginning. Which brings up the question, who made God? Page 92, 93. I think everybody probably who starts to question, is there a God, is there not a God, or believe in God, but where did God come from? Who made God? Pages 92 and 93 are out there. Is a question that confirms our commitment to the law of causality. Let's just right up front say, the moment a child or an adult says, well, who made God? How did God come into being? Right? Well, then suddenly we're affirming the law of causality. We recognize that we live in a cause and effect universe. Everything we experience in this universe that has a cause had a precedent, or as an effect, has a precedent cause that started it. So the question then is God caused or uncaused? Again, we're back to logic. There is no other option. God is either an uncaused being or someone or something caused God to exist, but God is eternal and requires no precedent cause. Otherwise, by definition, he's God. Right? If someone created God, then God, what we call God is not actually God. Whoever created God is actually God. What are we doing? We're kicking the can back down the road again, because somehow the whole thing had to get started, and so we're not interested in the intermediate who made this God and who made that God. We're interested who started it all, and that's the God we're really talking about. Yeah. Man in our image? Yeah. It means the Trinity. It's an allusion or a reference to the Trinity, and it starts right there in what you're quoting from Genesis chapter 1. Okay, and so what we see, this is outside of the scope of here, but I'd love to talk to you about it, and that is, so we see from the very first verse of the Bible, okay, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The word there in Hebrew for God is actually plural. Okay. And it's plural. There's a plurality of the being, the existence of God. What's interesting, though, is that plural noun for Elohim, for God, is always used with a singular verb. Like we have in English rules of grammar, you use singular verbs with singular nouns and plural with plural. Our image, and we suddenly start seeing that we are made in the image of God. And then throughout the rest of Scripture, it's not that it's not God having a conversation with the angels. He's not turning to the angels and saying, hey, angels, let's make man in our image, because angels aren't made in the image of God. The only beings that in the Bible that are made in the image of God are human beings. So he's talking to himself. Let us make man in our image is another statement of the plurality of God, one God in three persons. And that whole thing, that whole statement of the Trinity continues to develop throughout the rest of Scripture. There's many other places in the Old Testament that refer to God in more than one person. And then you certainly see it in the New Testament, where Jesus is referred to as God, the Holy Spirit is referred to as God, and God the Father is referred to as God. One God, three persons. Make sense? Good. Yeah.
Now I'm really
Okay.
confused. Because,
One what and three who?
Yeah.
because I didn't think Jesus, I thought he was, well, he is part of the Trinity, but he didn't exist in the beginning.
No, he did. He absolutely began. Listen, he pre-existed. What he became incarnate as a human being. He added humanity to what he already existed. But he was in the beginning with God, and through him all things were made that were made. John chapter 1, right? Yeah. And so, and like he tells the Pharisees who are challenging him in John chapter 8, right? Before Abraham was, I am. Right? I existed not just when Abraham existed, I existed before Abraham was even, any human beings ever existed. I am, I exist. And so Christ, as the second member of the Trinity, has always existed. But he was begotten in the sense of became a human being in addition to his divinity in what we see in the Gospels 2,000 years ago. That help? Yeah. Again, we have to remember in all of these kind of concepts that a God that's understandable enough to completely be understood by our own minds is not big enough to be the God of the universe. We'll never truly understand the character, nature, glory, power, all that God is. We can only understand and comprehend what he's revealed to us about himself. He's revealed to himself that he's eternal. He's revealed to himself that he's all-powerful. He's revealed to himself that he has all knowledge, all wisdom. And so he's revealed that stuff to us. And when Moses asks, in Exodus chapter 3, he says, who shall I say that you are? He says, I exist. The God who created everything, the God who is, I created everything. Moses, how do you want me to answer your question? I exist. I'm the only thing that makes sense because I actually exist. Without him pre-existing everything, nothing else makes sense because you're always looking for that what caused the effect. God is sometimes referred to as the uncaused first cause. Right? He's the uncaused, because he exists in himself, cause of everything that follows from him. Okay. So God is eternal, and therefore, we can't keep kicking the can down the road. We have to have something that's eternal. We have to have something that has the power to exist within itself for anything to exist. Anything. Because we recognize we live in this cause and effect universe, and we all want to know, well, where did that come from, and where did that come from, and where did that come from, and we keep going back and back and back. Eventually, you have to get to a starting point, and that starting point has to pre-exist everything. Logically, the only way. And so it's interesting that logic matches perfectly with God's self-attestation in Scripture. I exist, and logically, we need something that pre-existed everything in order for anything else to exist. So, anyway, get a little bit ahead of the logic and the development here. All right. So, if the universe is not eternal, right, but we know that it's definitely not eternal, then by necessity, something outside the universe must be eternal. We don't, logically, we're not trying to present God yet. We just have to say something out there, that multiverse generator, if you want to fall into that category, or God, or some other entity or something, has to be existent before everything else, eternal. Because we know the world, the universe that we live in, had a beginning. Time, space, matter, energy, all had a beginning. So what began it? Something outside of it had to. Something must be eternal, because you can't get something out of nothing. Something has to be there. And if nothing's there, then nothing can come from it. But something had to exist before everything else. Science, logic, reason, without relying on claims from Scripture yet in our development of our study here, demand the first cause to be. This is, what are the resume requirements of this first cause? Don't need the Bible. Okay, we just need logic, inductive reasoning, and logic, all those things to say, what do we need to get the universe started? We know it had a beginning. Everybody agrees now it had a beginning. What would be the characteristics of that which started the universe we have? We'd have to be self-existent. Because other than that, if you need somebody to start you, well, then you need somebody to start them, and you need somebody to start them. Keep going back until you get to a self-existent entity. Must be timeless, because they're not bound by time, space, matter, and energy within the universe they created. Must be non-spatial, right? Not bound up in material things. Must be immaterial. The first cause must be without limits. By it himself or itself, it must be infinite, because you can't add anything to it. He's created it all. This is just logic demanding that this is what the creator or that which created the universe would look like or have. Number 2, unimaginably powerful. This universe is incredibly large. The sun, just our own teeny tiny little sun compared to most other suns or many other suns or stars in the universe is just, I mean, the power that emits from this is just incredible. Okay, so in order for him to create it all of that or put that into existence, he must have far more power than that to be able to bring it all into existence. And because we're, as we'll look at here in the next session, he must be supremely intelligent because the universe screams design everywhere with incredible precision. We'll, again, talk about that later. What we'd also demand is it be personal, distinct, being without, a distinct being with a volition or a will. He has a purpose, he has a plan, he has a will. Not an impersonal, unintelligent force or, like dark matter. The science wants to say, oh, dark matter, it's that kind of the answer for everything. We don't know what we can't find it, but we can guess that it exists. You got dark matter, dark energy, all these things you can't measure, but that becomes their God because they're like, well, we'll just appeal to dark matter. We'll appeal to dark energy and figure out a way to get things to start in the universe. But that doesn't scream design. Everything we have in the universe that we see, from the smallest to the largest, screams intelligent design and purpose. So, he would have purpose, he would have a will, and created all that we observe. Okay? Impersonal forces, like dark matter, dark energy, don't have choices. They don't make choices. They just are. But we see throughout the universe, the observable evidence shows intelligence, purpose, design. So the most reasonable conclusion to the evidence that the universe had a beginning is that God exists. There is no other rational explanation that can explain the existence of everything. All attempts by atheists to assert that the uncaused first cause is not God are futile. They have no facts, they have no evidence to explain away God from reality. There's just, we recognize we live in this closed system, a universe. It has time, space, matter, and energy. It's incredibly vast. It's incredibly got a huge, vast amount of potential and realized energy in it. How do you explain all that? And they appeal to all kinds of things, right? They appeal to aliens. They appeal to multiverse generators. They appeal to Big Bang explosions. But they don't have any evidence. And all it is just a replacement for God. What's your God? It's the Big Bang. What's your God? It's dark matter. What's your God? It's a multiverse generator. I mean, they want to call it something other than God because everything I just named will never hold anybody accountable for their sins. God, if we get to that point, does hold people accountable for their sins. So they're willing to put trust in aliens. They're willing to put trust in multiverse generators. They're willing to put trust in I don't know, something exploded and suddenly everything came into existence. But they're not willing to put their faith in God because God means accountability. God means submitting to his authority. And these people who hold these views do not want to submit to the God that must have created them by objective, rational thought and reasoning behind it. All right, so I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. I've used this for years. Like I said, I've kind of, not trying to brag or do anything like that, just studied all kinds of stuff over decades. Here's what I would say is we're talking about this whole how to get things started within the universe. Here's what I have listed out as what I think are required miracles of evolution. When I say miracle, I mean I'm actually using the scientific definition. Scientific definition of a miracle, meaning the impossible, but maybe possibly somehow it could happen. They use an equation of 10 to the 50th power, meaning a number with 50 zeros after it. Okay, anything that has a probability of happening by chance with more than 50 zeros after it is considered absurd and a miracle, and virtually everything that I'm going to present to you here is way worse than that. Not just 50 zeros. We're talking thousands of zeros or millions of zeros of super infinitely small probabilities. Okay, so their first miracle is out of nothing, matter, space, time, and energy all somehow sprang into existence without any kind of aid from anything outside force. Matter in an infinitely small ball is the Big Bang theory here. At the center of the universe exploded and expanded into the universe without any kind of outside energy source to cause the explosion, much less where did the material come from. Requires a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. If you don't know what that is, that means it's called the conservation of matter and energy. We can't create matter and we can't destroy matter. All we can do is convert matter into energy. Okay? And so we say all that we have in the universe is all we'll ever get. We're not going to get any more matter. We're not going to get any more energy. All we can do is play with its configuration. So it violates that because how do you get, somehow we got it. Where did it come from? It violates the second law of thermodynamics. That's that entropy law, that everything is winding down. Yet somehow they're saying at the beginning it wound up and then it started winding down. But their own law says, no, everything winds down. You see, for life to exist, like if you heard of like the Urey Miller experiment where they, quote, created life in a test tube, complete fabrication, complete cheating of the process. You'll notice they always exclude oxygen from their test tubes and whatever they were doing because you can't have oxygen in it. But the second, the microsecond you have life, you better have oxygen because all life requires oxygen. So you have this, gosh, you have to have oxygen in order for life. You can't have oxygen for the parts of life to spring to life. So you also see this, all this like this primordial goop and soup that's out there. You have to have ammonia-rich. It has to be a very ammonia-rich atmosphere for these building blocks of life to come together. That's why it has to be done in a test tube. It's not done in the world because the world is hostile to these formations of life. Also have to have methane-rich atmosphere. Hydrogen has to be highly available, readily available, and it wouldn't be in the Earth's atmosphere. DNA and protein. I mean, well, if you don't know, you can't produce protein without DNA. All protein comes at the instruction of DNA building protein. However, DNA itself is made up of protein. So how do you get DNA without protein, or how do you get protein without DNA? A violation of the law of mass action just says that chemical reactions, there's this law of mass action where the chemicals that want to bind together will do so readily, and that is they're requiring that chemicals that don't want to bind together are the ones we need to bind together to get life. Okay? In incredibly long chains of like amino acids that never, ever, ever want to bind together. Violation of chemical equilibrium, like water is the universal solvent. These chemicals, and like they talk about like monkeys at the typewriter, right? You've heard these kind of things. Monkeys at the typewriter will produce all the works of Shakespeare and the Bible and all these things if you just keep on typing. Well, the problem is they type, in the real world that we live in, they type things in, and as soon as they take their hands off the keyboard, they untype themselves. These chemical reactions, they might bind together for a microsecond, but then the law of equilibrium says, no, they actually prefer not to be bound together. And so they unbind more readily than they bind together. But you need to bind hundreds of precise amino acids together just to get the start of the DNA protein working. Amino acids, asking that these amino acids would form in a watery environment. Doesn't happen. They don't like to do that. Chirality, left-handed, right-handed. They got all these things. They have to be precise in order to make it work. All these, again, super technical terms like non-performance of biochemical reaction just says it's impossible. And you always hear this, infinity. Given enough time, anything can happen. Right? And they say anything can happen given enough time. Actually, time is the enemy of every one of these processes. Because time, because of the second law of thermodynamics, will tend to force them to decay and destruct, not to increase in complexity, not to increase in design and order. So every single one of these requires a statistical miracle. There's not a single piece of evidence that supports these theories. Every part of it is entire conjecture, from the Big Bang explosion that started the universe, supposedly, from the primordial soup that sprang somehow abiogenesis into life. No evidence, requires a miracle. And then every transitional form to get from single cell to multi-cell and all these things, there's still no evidence after hundreds of years of, or more than 150 years of searching for it. and there's still no evidence for any transitional forms. And every single one of them would require a miracle for them to come into or change from one form to another, because it would violate that DNA principle that it's a digital code. Every single living thing has a DNA digital code, and you can't get from point A to point B. You can't get from reptile to bird with the DNA that they have. You need different DNA to make it work. Atomic stability, every single multi-component organ in a living system. We talked about the eye. How do you get the eye to function? Through intermediate steps like Darwin proposed. Digestive system. How do you get something that lives without being able to bring in energy from the outside world, process that energy, and then expend the waste of unconsumed material? All that, whether it's a single cell or a human being, you still need the same systems to function and work, or you don't have life. Brain. Do you realize an ant is doing more calculations as it moves every single one of its legs and moves its head and looks through its eyes? It's doing more calculations than the most powerful computer on the planet in order to live, in order to function. Nervous system, circulatory system, respiratory system, reproductive system. Even if you got some miracle happening where this creature turned from an amphibian to a reptile, it needs somebody to mate with that has the same compatibility with it. So you get some one accident, that's a supposed accident that happens, you get some, gecko or whatever out there, and now it's looking around for somebody to mate with. And if it doesn't find somebody to mate with, the fact that it became a gecko dies within this single generation, right? You have to have a reproductive system and compatibility with the mate to make that work. Sonar systems, incredibly complex with bats and dolphins and all these kind of things. We talked about last week, I'll probably finish with this, I think we're almost done anyway, anthropic principle. All of these incredibly knife-edge fine-tuning of the universe. Most of this may not mean anything to you. I'm just going to read through it. Stability of the proton. Stability of the proton. So scientists today still don't know why atoms are held together. They say it requires some force from outside the atom, actually probably from outside the universe, to hold the atoms together, but we don't know what it is. The size of our sun, the color of our sun, the age of the sun, the mass of the sun, the distance of the Earth from the sun, the surface gravity of the Earth, the thickness of our Earth's crust, the rotation on a 24-hour period. If it was slower, we'd have ice ages. We would never, ever get out of ice cycles. If it was faster, we would not have a stable water supply or a consistent water supply. Gravitational interaction between the Earth and the moon. It's super important that the Earth and the moon are in the relationship they are. The size of the moon, the size of the Earth, all these things are super important. The magnetic field that protects us from all of this interstellar radiation stuff that happens out there, it's so designed for us to have life here. The tilt of the Earth, that 23-degree tilt of the Earth is vital. We wouldn't have life without the right tilt of the Earth. The reflectivity, the amount of sunlight that penetrates but also reflects back is perfect. The oxygen to nitrogen ratio within the Earth's atmosphere is super important. Carbon dioxide and water vapor levels. Without it, you don't have life. The entropy levels of how it's not any faster, that we're not winding down any faster. The mass of the universe, the number of stars in the universe, the ozone layer, all of these things are precise to the point where if you change it in like a tenth of a fraction of a percent, most everything else falls apart and dies. You start to see there's all kinds of issues with this a spark and soup kind of experiments to get life, or a big bang to get the universe. And then we have some of these, what you might call chicken and egg problems, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, which came first? The hypothesized primordial goo that needed the oxygen for life, but oxygen would destroy life, the building blocks. So how do you get there? It's a chicken and egg. Do you have an oxygen-free environment, or do you have an oxygen-rich environment? I don't know why that's so small. The DNA protein, we talked about DNA. Did you get DNA from protein, or do you get protein from DNA? How did you manage that? And all these long periods of time. You have to have long periods of time to make evolution work. But if you have long periods of time, it will destroy the evolutionary processes. because time is destructive. Time is the enemy, even though they want time to be their ally. So there's your science chapter, if you will, on all of this. This is like trying to go through and say, what makes the most sense? We're looking again, conclusion here. The box top of life. Does the box top of life scream God or a source that brought everything into existence? Or does it seem like randomness, accident, chance, explosions, no purpose, no intelligence behind it all? Everything seems to scream God is the cause, the uncaused first cause that brought everything into existence, and we have to look at it from an objective standpoint and say the evidence leads me to conclude that I don't have enough faith to believe it happened by chance or accident. Yeah. So with that, we'll continue on next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.